Today's video is going to be on how I stabilize wood for my knife handles or pen blanks. We're going to talk a little bit about drying the wood. We're going to talk a little bit about my setup. You know, I don't have a proper vacuum chamber. I've got a pretty basic setup. I use a giant mason jar. We're going to talk about, you know, my process and how I do it. It may not be the right way, may not be the wrong way. Maybe some of you guys will get some tips out of it. I hope so. So enjoy the video and like and share or comment if you want. Alright, so yesterday I went to the local woodcraft store, which is right down the street, and I like to browse the wood in there, and I found a fantastic 6x6x3 big chunk of big leaf maple burl. I was blown away. You know, for only 32 bucks, I snatched that thing up. And what I did from there was just pondered how to cut this thing up to get the best looking blocks. And I gotta tell you, sometimes I'm not successful, and sometimes I'm really successful at that, because, you know, hindsight's 20/20. So once I bring my block home, I use my bandsaw right here, my little Rikon bandsaw, and I will chop it up into 2x2x6, or try to get 2x2x6, or whatever the block will yield. So I wound up getting 6 blocks out of this piece, and once it's cut up, you need to make sure it's dry. I think if you read some of the directions on like Stick Fast or Cactus Juice, that they want less than 10% moisture in the wood. Well, I don't have a way to measure moisture. Some of that equipment seems to be pretty pricey. So what I do is I have a old pottery kiln that I use for tempering, and it's got a temperature controller in it. I stick the wood into the kiln at 210 degrees. I actually have a big Pyrex dish. I put the wood in the dish. After it's been chopped up into blocks, I put the wood in the dish, and then I cover the wood in tin foil, so it's not open to the elements of the oven, because in the past I have burned wood because it was too close to one of the heating elements. So I wrap it up, you know, it's kind of like a casserole. It looks like a casserole in there, and I will bake that for 24 hours at 210 degrees. It's not a number I pulled out of the air. I talked to some folks that sell, you know, stabilized wood for a living, and there's one gentleman that was pretty good with giving some information out. But he once told me, if you don't know how much moisture is in the block, just bake it for 24 hours. You know, weigh it before you put it in, and weigh it when you take it out. You could go through this process where you take it out, put it on the scale, and weigh it, and once it stops losing weight, you're probably fairly close to having no water in it. So from my past experiments, it seems like 24 hours kind of works, and most of the wood I get anyway is pretty dry. I've had some wood where you could see the steam and stuff coming out of it, and when it's that wet and you put it in a kiln at 220 degrees overnight, it cracks. So when I get something that's really wet like that, I'll sit it on the floor in the shop. Heck, I'll forget about it. I may sit there for 6 months to a year before I get to it. Okay, so once I've baked the wood for 24 hours, it's got to cool. You have to cool it before you put the resin on it, or in it, or put it in the resin. Or if you put a hot piece of wood in there, it will cure the resin, and your wood is shot. You ruined your vat of resin. It's just bad news. So what I do is I cool it in the large mason jar that I'm going to stabilize it in. I think that is important, because as the hot piece of wood is cooling, if you have it in the open air, it's going to suck in the ambient moisture, and we don't want moisture in our blocks, because it impedes the stabilization process. just through learning, I've noticed that the more moisture in the wood, the harder it is to pull the vacuum and have the bubbles stop. That's just how, I don't know scientifically if that's true, but I've noticed through trial and error on stabilizing my own wood that the drier it is, you pull a vacuum for an hour or two, bubbles stop, and I usually let the wood sit in the resin for a couple of days, and then I take it out and cure it in the oven. Alright, so this is my tempering oven, and you can see there it's set to 210. It's actually 217. That's what the thermostat, the thermocouple is reading inside. This is actually big. It's 14 inches cubed, so it's big in there. So there you go. There's my wood casserole. I like to keep it in there. This has been in here since about 10 o'clock yesterday morning. And it just, I just put it in there. It sits in there like that, cover it up, and just let it bake away. So I need to get some gloves, my welding gloves, pull that out of there because that sucker's hot. All right, so here's my wood casserole. Okay, and there's the blocks. This is some big leaf maple burl that I got yesterday. So far, the blocks didn't work very bad. You could tell they're super light. This one cracked a little bit. So the next thing I do is I take these blocks and I grab this great big mason jar. Okay? And I will, sometimes I could get 3 of them in here. Let's see. Well, not this time. Yep. So 2 of them goes in there, and then I like to take a piece of paper towel, stick it in here, and let's get a lid. Okay. It will sit in here until it's cool. So about an hour or 2, I'll come back and open it up and grab it with my hand. If it's warm at all, not gonna stabilize it till it is nice and cool. So you want it about to be the ambient temperature of the air in your shop. So, all right, here they will sit until they are cool enough to fill the jars with resin. All right, now, once your wood is cool, let's go ahead and open up the lid. We're gonna put some weight on top of the blocks. Okay, we got the weight on top of the blocks because once you pour the resin in there, the blocks will float and it'll come up, and you don't want them to come up. So you want to weight them down and then put in your resin. Okay, you don't want to fill this thing all the way up to the top. You need to have some headroom because once you pull the vacuum, bubbles, it's going to foam and it's going to want to come up. So in a container like this, I've got a valve, and I'll show you when we get to that point, but I've got a valve that I have to regulate it so we don't pull 100% of the vacuum in the beginning, because it will foam up and it'll get sucked up into your vacuum pump and it'll ruin your vacuum pump. So right now you want to fill it about a ½ inch to an inch above the wood, and I'll let this sit. I'll let this sit for an hour or so and let some of it just kind of seep in. Then I'll go ahead and put my vacuum pump on there and I'll start pulling the vacuum. Alright folks, this is as basic as it gets as far as setup for you know, a DIY vacuum chamber. So I've got it in my grinding, I got it in where my grinder is. Right up here is a dust extractor. I actually turned that on because the vacuum pump kind of creates some sort of a mist or a gas or a fog in the shop, and it stinks really bad. So I turned that on and it sucks all that out up and it blows it out the top in the attic of the garage. Anyway, so this is just a super basic setup with a large mason jar lid. Okay, mason jar lid. I've got a valve. You can control what you're gonna do. So basically, get that on there pretty good. Okay, let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. Bear with me here. All right, so here's our control valve. This is going to control the amount of vacuum. So I'm going to start closing that down, and you'll start to see the bubbles appear. Okay, you can see here it's starting to foam. If I close this thing all the way down, it'll foam up and get sucked right into the vacuum pump. Ask me how I know. That's right, I did it. So now this is kind of the waiting game. I'm in the shop working anyway, so I'll watch this, and you can see as the foam starts dissipating, I'll start closing the valve even more until I'm getting the full vacuum pull. And eventually, you see it already went down. Eventually, there'll be no more air or very little air. So I will turn this off now, and I'll come back later and show you when it's ready to be removed from the vacuum. Okay, so this thing's been on several hours, about 4 hours now. There's bubbles still going, they're still coming out. I'm pulling full vacuum, but my vacuum pump is really, really hot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release the vacuum and turn it off and let it cool down for a little while. But the important point I want to show you is watch the level here. Okay, watch the level when I release the vacuum and I turn off the pump. It's going down fast. You want to add to it. You don't want to expose the wood. From what I understand, when you expose the wood, it's going to suck air back into the block. So right now you've created a negative potential in the block. You pulled all the air out of it. And once you release that vacuum, it's trying to fill that space with the resin. So you want to make sure this will happen for the next couple hours. The resin level in the jar will lower because it's going to get sucked into the blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this here for a little while, let that pump cool down, and then I'm going to start it again. I don't think there's a big deal stopping and starting. I've had to do that a few times in the past. It's not a big deal. My blocks still come out really, really nice. But as you can see, just sitting here talking, that level's slowly going down, and you want to keep pouring resin on that so you don't expose the top of the blocks. Okay, so once the bubbles stopped coming out of the wood, I turned off the vacuum, released the vacuum here on this valve, and I let it sit overnight just so all the stabilizing resin could migrate back into the wood. So what I'm going to do next is pull the wood out of here, dry it off a little bit, wrap it up in tin foil, and get ready to put it in the oven to cure. All right, so let's get that out of there. This happens to be Tuya burl that I don't know if this took very much resin. I didn't weigh it before I decided to put the resin in it, but so here we go. Let's clean it off a little bit. It's definitely heavier than okay. All right, so now what I like to do is wrap it up. Well, it's probably a good thing to do. Wrap it up in some tin foil. And one. Okay, that's going to go into the kiln, and the kiln is currently heating up to 200 degrees, and I'll put that in there. What you will get after it's cured is this. This is some Buckeye burl that I just did. You can see how there's a little bit of bleed out on this stuff. I'm actually trying a new product anyway. This is called Ultra Seal. It's a bunch more expensive than Cactus Juice or the Stick Fast stuff. This was 55 bucks for a half gallon. I don't know that it's any better than the other stuff. So this is after it sat in the vacuum for a couple hours, release the vacuum and let it sit overnight to absorb all the resin, and baked for 2 hours at 200 degrees, and this is what you get. All right, guys, here's some takeaways from doing your home stabilization. You know, I've been able to, you know, do some really neat woods. Black ash burl. It's a spalted alder, I believe. Yeah, you know, doing this at home is not a bad idea. The mason jar as your vacuum chamber. I used to think it was a good idea until I posted it on Reddit, and then I got a bunch of folks upset over it, saying that it's very dangerous, that it could implode. I haven't had it happen. That's not saying it won't happen. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you got some tips, and thanks for watching.